3 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called and said 7 words that split my life in half. Don't come home this year. Clara wants peace. My name is Evelyn Moore. I was 33 then, living alone in a small apartment overlooking the gray waterfront in Seattle, and up until that call, some stubborn part of me still believed that if I stayed gentle enough, useful enough, easy enough to love, my family would eventually make room for me in a way that felt real. I had already bought my train ticket back to Ashford Heights in Oregon, already packed my suitcase, already wrapped a jar of homemade cranberry jam for my mother and a wool scarf for my father, because that is what daughters like me do. We keep showing up with our hands full even when our hearts have been sent away 100 times before. At first, I thought she was joking, but my mother did not joke in that flat, cold voice. She said Clara was pregnant again. She did not need stress. And I always turned everything into drama. I remember standing in the middle of my bedroom with one boot in my hand and the other still by the closet, staring at the rain streaking down the window, trying to understand how asking why I had been left out of one more family gathering had somehow become proof that I was the problem. I asked her what exactly I had done, and she sighed the way she always did when she wanted me to feel childish for having feelings at all. She said I asked too many questions, I made things uncomfortable, and just this, once I needed to think of someone other than myself. That was the kind of sentence that had followed me all my life, a polished little knife disguised as wisdom. When I was 15, my birthday dinner was canceled because Clara had a breakup and needed the family more. When I graduated college with honors, my parents arrived after the ceremony was over, because Clara had a doctor's appointment, and everyone agreed that was more important. When my grandmother Jasmine got sick, I was the one who sat by her bed reading to her while the rest of the family posted photos about cherishing every moment. And when she died, they somehow managed to arrange everything so quickly that by the time I understood what had happened, the funeral was over and the decisions had all been made. Still, some foolish part of me kept trying. I called my father after my mother hung up. I wanted him to say one thing, just one, that would make me feel less disposable. Instead, after a long silence, he told me it might be better if I listened to my mother this year. Better for whom, I wanted to ask, but I already knew the answer. Better for Clara. Better for peace. Better for the family story, where I was always the difficult daughter and never the hurt one. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the useless ticket in my hand while the room grew darker around me. The candle I had lit earlier smelled like pumpkin and cinnamon, an artificial kind of warmth, and I remember thinking how cruel it was that even the room felt like it was pretending to be home. That night I finally admitted something I had spent years trying not to see. In my family, I had never been the one they protected. I had been the one they expected to understand. The acceptable loss. The daughter who was supposed to shrink quietly so the others could remain comfortable. If you are listening right now and you have ever been the one who was told to stay calm, stay quiet, stay understanding while everyone else got to be selfish, then tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there, because I know how lonely it feels to be the one who keeps swallowing your own pain just to keep the room peaceful. That night I thought I was only being excluded from Thanksgiving, but I did not know I was really being pushed away from a secret my family had buried years earlier, a secret tied to my grandmother Jasmine's will, and to the inheritance they had never intended for me to question. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and hollow, and my phone stayed silent in that way. Silence can feel louder than cruelty. No message from my mother. No awkward peace offering from my father. No polite text from Clara pretending everything was normal. I made instant coffee and sat by the window wrapped in a blanket, watching people hurry through the wet Seattle streets carrying pies and flowers and grocery bags, little moving portraits of belonging. Around noon I made the mistake of opening Instagram. The first thing I saw was a photo Clara had posted. My parents were at the dining table, my mother smiling with both hands around a glass of wine, my father standing behind her, Clara glowing in a cream sweater with one hand over her stomach, her husband beside her, their little boy in a turkey print shirt. The caption said, "Grateful for the people who show up for family." I stared at that line until the words blurred. 4 adults. 1 child, a beautiful table, and not even an empty chair where I might have existed in theory. They had not simply excluded me, they had edited me out. I put my phone down and sat very still for a long time. Part of me wanted to spend the entire day under a blanket pretending the holiday meant nothing, but another part, some exhausted and stubborn corner of me, refused to let them take the whole day. If I had to be alone, I would at least be alone somewhere warm, somewhere with light and people, and the sound of plates, not buried inside my own grief. That is how I ended up at a little restaurant in Seabrook called the Lantern Table, standing in a damp coat while the hostess asked if it was just one. There is something humiliating about answering yes to that question on a holiday, especially when you are trying not to cry in public. She seated me at a small table near the window beside a large family gathering. I remember the smell first: roasted turkey, butter, rosemary, cinnamon, and then the sounds: overlapping voices, little bursts of laughter, silverware tapping glass. The family at the table next to me looked like one of those scenes people think are too sentimental to be real. At the center sat an older couple, elegant in a comfortable way, the kind of people who knew how to make warmth feel effortless. Beside them sat a younger couple with 2 children, and across from them was a man about my age with dark hair, a tired smile, and the gentle patience of someone who had learned how to be kind without making a performance of it. Later I would know him as Adrian, but then he was only a face I kept trying not to look at. My food arrived and I could barely taste it. I kept moving mashed potatoes around my plate while my eyes burned. I had told myself all morning that I would not cry, that I was too grown for this, too old to keep wanting the kind of family that did not want me back. But grief does not care about pride. It comes when the body is tired enough to stop pretending. I turned my face toward the window and dabbed at my eyes with the napkin, hoping no one had noticed, and that was when I heard a soft voice beside me ask, "Honey, are you all right?" I looked up and saw the older woman from the next table standing there. She had silver hair pinned neatly back and eyes that seemed to understand before I said a word. I did what women like me often do when we are caught hurting in public. I lied politely. I said I was fine, just allergies. She smiled, not mocking, just wise. "Allergies usually don't break your heart on Thanksgiving," she said. Something about the gentleness in her voice cracked the last bit of composure I had left. She introduced herself as Eleanor Bennett, then looked toward her family's crowded table and back at me. "No one should eat alone today," she said. "Come sit with us." I refused immediately, out of habit more than conviction. I did not want to intrude, did not want pity, did not want to discover that kindness could vanish the moment I accepted it. But her husband Jonathan waved from the table and said I would only be saving him from having to listen to one more argument about pumpkin pie. The children giggled. The man with the dark hair smiled, small and easy, and looked down at his glass as if to make the invitation less overwhelming. I went because Eleanor asked like she meant it, and because some wounded part of me wanted to believe there was still a place in the world where an empty seat might genuinely be for me. They made room without fuss. They passed me bread, poured me wine, introduced themselves as if adding one more person to the table was the most natural thing in the world. Eleanor and Jonathan. Their eldest son Daniel, his wife Olivia, their children Noah and Mila, and the younger son, Adrian Cole. The table was loud and affectionate, and gloriously imperfect. Jonathan told a terrible joke about a turkey and a laptop that made the children howl. Olivia rolled her eyes with loving theatricality. Daniel argued about football. Adrian leaned toward me once and whispered a running translation of the family dynamics, so I would not feel like an outsider. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time that day. And later, when the pie plates were half empty and the children had wandered off to stare at the rain through the front windows, Eleanor sat beside me and asked very gently why I had been alone. I told her the truth in pieces, about the call, about Clara not wanting drama, about being the daughter who was always too much whenever I asked to be treated fairly. Eleanor listened the way some people pray, with stillness and respect. Then she placed her hand over mine and said something I did not know I had needed to hear all my life. The person they call difficult is often the person who notices what is unfair. I looked at her and felt the room shift. She told me she had spent decades working in family law before retiring, and that families often buried greed and fear under language like peace, loyalty, and keeping things comfortable. I did not know it then, But that was the moment the first thread loosened. Because when she heard my last name, Moore, something moved behind her eyes. Something she did not say aloud yet. And if you are still with me here. Listening to a woman tell you about the night strangers showed her more grace than her own blood ever did. Then tell me honestly in the comments whether you believe chosen family can sometimes be more real than the family we are born into. Because the answer to that question changed everything that came after. I did not go to the Bennett's Sunday dinner the next week, or the week after that. I kept Eleanor's card in my wallet and took it out more times than I want to admit, running my thumb over the phone number she had written on the back, as if the ink itself carried some kind of courage. People who grow up being tolerated instead of treasured do not know what to do with open invitations. We wait for the hidden condition, the awkwardness, the moment someone realizes they were kinder than they meant to be. But Eleanor did not forget me. The following Tuesday evening, while I was half working and half staring blankly at my laptop, she called just to ask whether I had eaten anything decent that day or if I was surviving on coffee again. The question was so ordinary, so maternal, that it nearly undid me. No one in my own family had ever called simply to check whether I was okay. By the third Sunday, I found myself standing outside their house in Brook Hollow in the cold, looking at the warm yellow light spilling across the porch and wondering why crossing one small front path felt more frightening than confronting lawyers. Adrian opened the door before I knocked. He smiled like he had been expecting me all along. "You made it," he said, in that calm, low voice of his, and somehow, those 3 words did not feel like pressure. They felt like relief. Dinner that night was roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans with almonds, and a lemon tart Jonathan claimed he had helped with, though no one believed him. Nothing about the evening was grand, and that was exactly what made it extraordinary. No one interrogated me. No one made a dramatic spectacle out of welcoming me. They simply made room. Week by week, their table became part of my life. Noah and Mila started calling me Aunt Evie. Olivia texted me recipes. Daniel asked my opinion on things as if my answer mattered. Jonathan argued with me about old movies and insisted I was wrong in the most affectionate way possible. Eleanor remembered everything: how I took my tea, which topics made me quiet, the date of a work presentation I had once mentioned in passing. And Adrian, quietly, steadily, became my safest place. We started with conversations after dinner while drying dishes side by side, then late-night walks through Seattle, then phone calls that stretched past midnight because neither of us wanted to be the first to say goodnight. He never pushed. He never demanded explanations. He listened in a way that made honesty feel less like exposure and more like rest. Months passed, winter turned to spring, and during all that time my biological family remained silent. No birthday message, no Christmas card, no apology, no explanation. At first, their silence hurt. Then, gradually, it turned into something else. Evidence, maybe, that I had never mattered to them in the way I kept hoping I would. One soft spring afternoon, after almost a year of Sunday dinners, Eleanor invited me to sit with her on the back porch while the others cleaned up inside. The garden was just beginning to wake up, tulips pushing through damp soil, birds fighting noisily over the feeder Jonathan had installed with unnecessary confidence and very little practical skill. Eleanor handed me a mug of tea and asked, almost casually, whether I knew much about my grandmother, Jasmine's estate. The question landed so sharply I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I told her no, only that everything had been settled quickly after the funeral and no one had really talked about it. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said that during her years in family law, she had known another attorney in Ashford Heights who handled probate and inheritance matters for several older families in the area. She had heard, not in an official way, but in the sideways manner that professional circles pass things along, that a case involving a woman named Jasmine Moore had been unusually tense because one granddaughter had been named more directly than the rest of the family liked. I went still. My grandmother had once told me by the creek behind her house that some things in life should go to the person who knows how to care, not merely to the person who knows how to claim. At the time, I thought she was talking about heirlooms. Suddenly I wondered if she had meant something far larger. Eleanor was careful, measured. She did not accuse anyone outright. She only said that if families go to great lengths to label one person dramatic, it is sometimes because that person is the most likely to ask the question everyone else hopes will stay buried. That night I barely slept. Memory rearranged itself into a new pattern. The way my mother had gotten a new SUV, less than a year after Grandma died, despite always complaining about money. The kitchen renovation Clara bragged about online. My father's refusal to answer direct questions about the Willow Creek property my grandmother loved. For the first time, it occurred to me that maybe I had not simply been pushed out emotionally, maybe I had been pushed out strategically. With Eleanor's quiet help, I began looking into public records, property transfers, probate filings, trust dissolutions. The deeper I looked, the colder I became. My name appeared in a late-filed appendix as beneficiary of an educational and discretionary trust connected to rental income from the Willow Creek land. There was language in the paperwork that suggested my grandmother had intended it specifically for me. Yet within a year of her death, the trust had been dissolved, its assets folded elsewhere, signatures all in place, notifications allegedly issued. I had never received a single one. I sat in Eleanor's study holding copies of those documents while the room seemed to tilt around me. I had spent years believing my family found me inconvenient. Now I understood something even uglier. They had needed me absent. And if you know what it feels like to discover that the story you were told about yourself was never the truth, that maybe you were not difficult, not too much, not ungrateful, but simply in the way of someone else's comfort or greed, then stay with me, because what I did next changed everything. Once the truth had a shape, I could not force it back into mystery. I spread copies of the records across my kitchen table that night. The public filings, the trust dissolution, the property transfer tied to Willow Creek. And I kept reading the same lines over and over, because the human mind has a strange delay when betrayal comes wearing familiar names. My mother's signature was there as executor. My father's name appeared as witness. Clara and her husband had benefited through a company structure that looked polished enough to pass for ordinary if nobody asked why it had all happened so quickly after my grandmother died. I stared at those papers until the letters blurred, and the ache inside me changed shape. It was no longer only the ache of being unwanted. It was the ache of realizing that my absence had been useful to them. Every year they had treated me like the difficult daughter, the emotional one, the question asker, because questions were dangerous to people living comfortably inside a lie. Eleanor did not rush me toward revenge, and that mattered. She did not feed my anger or give me the dramatic speeches people imagine in moments like that. She simply asked what I wanted if I pursued the truth. Not what I should want, not what would look strong, what I actually wanted. I remember sitting in her study, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, and answering in a voice that surprised me with its calm. I want them to stop being able to tell the story that I was the problem. That was when she connected me with a probate attorney in Tacoma, a woman named Rebecca Sloan, who had the rare gift of sounding both sharp and kind at the same time. Rebecca read everything, made notes in the margins, and explained that on paper there were several things worth challenging. Not only the notice failures, but the timing of the trust dissolution, and the way the asset transfers had been routed. She told me we could pursue a case, though it might settle quietly if the other side was afraid of public exposure. Public exposure. The phrase sounded almost too clean for what it meant. It meant people in Ashford Heights might learn that the respectable Moore family had quietly cut one daughter out while talking endlessly about loyalty and family values at church luncheons and holiday fundraisers. It meant my mother's polished image could crack. It meant Clara's life of soft victimhood might no longer fit so easily over the truth. For the first time in years, I was not scared of their disapproval. I was just tired of carrying the cost of their comfort. The months that followed were a strange split life. On one side there were Sunday dinners, noisy and affectionate, where Noah insisted on teaching me card tricks that never worked. Mila braided my hair while Olivia pretended not to laugh. Jonathan found new ways to ruin perfectly good desserts with overconfidence, and Eleanor looked at me sometimes with an expression so full of quiet pride that I had to look away. On the other side there were legal drafts, document requests, follow-up letters, account histories, and long phone calls with Rebecca. The more I learned, the less confusing my family became. There was almost a relief in it. Painful truth is cleaner than lifelong confusion. My mother had chosen control. Clara had chosen benefit. My father had chosen silence because silence let him keep calling himself gentle while doing nothing brave. I think that was the hardest part. Not the greed, not the money, but understanding that my father's softness had always had a cost, and I had paid it for years. During that time, Adrian and I drifted closer in the kind of way that cannot be forced and therefore feels almost holy when it happens. We talked after dinner while washing dishes. We drove along the coast on rainy evenings and sat in parked cars with coffee going cold between us while I told him pieces of my childhood I had never said out loud. He never gave me the lazy comfort of saying everything happened for a reason. He knew better than that. Instead, he would say things like, "What they did explains your pain, but it does not define your worth." And because he never spoke more than he meant, every word landed. One evening, we stood by Willow Creek in the fading light, the water moving slowly beneath the old bridge my grandmother used to love, and I told him I felt like my entire life had been built around trying to enter a room that was never open to me. He looked out over the creek and said, "Then maybe the bravest thing you can do is stop calling that room home." I cried quietly after that, not because it hurt, but because it felt true in a place deeper than thought. Rebecca eventually pressed hard enough that the other side shifted. The Moore family did what families like mine often do when the truth gets close enough to leave a mark. They negotiated. Quietly. Quickly. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no thrilling confession under oath. There was a settlement, a financial correction, a restoration of what should have been mine, and language crafted carefully enough to save the appearance of dignity for people who had not acted with much. When the first payment came through, I held the notice in my hand and felt almost nothing. Not joy, not triumph, only a strange stillness. Because money can acknowledge harm, but it cannot raise the dead parts of a childhood. It cannot return years spent begging for a softer gaze. It cannot give back the version of you that kept trying. If you have ever discovered that justice does not always feel victorious, only clarifying, then you understand what I mean. The real victory was not the settlement. It was that by the end of that year, I no longer wondered whether I had imagined the cruelty. I had proof, I had language, I had witnesses. And most unexpectedly of all, I had love beginning to grow somewhere I had not known to look. Because while I was learning how to stop asking my old family to choose me, I was also falling in love with a man who had quietly chosen me every day without once asking me to shrink. Adrian proposed on a September evening by Willow Creek, under a sky so soft and gold it looked almost too beautiful to belong to ordinary life. There was no orchestra, no carefully staged audience, no elaborate speech rehearsed to sound perfect. It was just him, the old wooden bridge, the smell of wet leaves, and the kind of quiet that feels sacred when you are with the right person. He looked more nervous than I had ever seen him, one hand in his coat pocket and the other reaching for mine, as if he needed that contact to steady himself. Then he said the thing that undid me before he even opened the ring box. "I can't promise you a life without hurt," he said, "but I can promise you that you will never have to wonder whether you are chosen." I was crying before he went down on one knee. My answer had probably lived in me for months already, in every ordinary kindness, every conversation that did not leave me ashamed, every moment he made love feel safe instead of conditional. When I said yes, the sound that left him was half laugh, half relief, and I think some part of my heart healed right there in the fading light. The Bennetts celebrated like people who had been waiting for joy and felt no need to hide it. Jonathan opened champagne far too early in the day. Olivia started talking about flowers and cake immediately. Noah and Mila argued over who would get the more important role in the wedding. Eleanor cried openly and refused to apologize for it. For a little while, I let myself stand inside that happiness without looking over my shoulder. Then the practical details began, and with them came one question that lodged itself like a stone in my chest. What would I do about the line on the invitation that read "Parents of the bride"? Biology is one kind of fact. Love is another. My biological parents were Helen and Robert Moore. The people who had carried me through the hardest years of my adult life were Jonathan and Eleanor Bennett. I sat with draft invitations spread across my lap, one rainy evening, and stared at that blank line until the words themselves seemed to pulse. Eleanor found me that way and sat down beside me without speaking at first. When I finally admitted what was troubling me, she listened quietly, then reminded me of something she had once said on the back porch, that the law sometimes understands chosen family better than society does. She asked whether I had ever truly considered adult adoption. Even though she had hinted at it before, hearing it plainly still stole my breath. Adult adoption. A legal recognition of a relationship that had already become true in every emotional sense. New next of kin. New family structure. New language. I looked at her and asked the question that frightened me most, not because I expected rejection, but because wanting it so badly made me feel exposed. Would you and Jonathan really want that? Her eyes filled immediately. Sweetheart, she said, and there was so much love in the word that I almost broke apart. We have thought of you as our daughter for a long time. We were just waiting for you to be ready. The process itself was not dramatic. Paperwork rarely is. There were forms, meetings, legal review, a court appearance, signatures, dates, official seals. But underneath all the bureaucracy was something surprisingly tender. Every step felt less like a transaction and more like a ceremony that confirmed what my heart had already known. The day the judge finalized it, I became Evelyn Bennett. I remember holding the order in my hands and feeling the strangest combination of grief and peace. Grieving what should have been, grieving the family that never learned how to love me well, and at the same time feeling the quiet miracle of being chosen on purpose. The invitations were eventually printed on heavy cream paper with deep blue lettering. That blank line was no longer blank. Parents of the bride, Jonathan and Eleanor Bennett. Adrian suggested a line in the program beneath it, simple and perfect. The family who chose her, and whom she chose back. For the first time, the truth on paper matched the truth inside my life. I did not send an invitation to the Moores. Not to punish them, not to create drama. Simply because weddings are not civic obligations. They are sacred gatherings of people who have shown up for your joy. My mother, however, found out anyway. Families like mine always do. About 2 months before the wedding, she appeared at my apartment unannounced, dressed beautifully, lips set in the hard line I knew too well. She did not begin with congratulations. She began with accusation. She said I was humiliating the family, that changing my name was theatrical and cruel, that blood was blood no matter what paperwork said. I stood in my doorway and felt, for the first time in my life, that I was not afraid of disappointing her. A mother is someone who protects a child when she is vulnerable. I told her, my voice steadier than I expected. Not someone who uses her as the easiest person to sacrifice. She stared at me, as if I had started speaking a language she did not understand. Before she left, she said something that stayed with me. You cannot cut family out of your life and expect them not to show up. It was not a warning. Not exactly. It was entitlement dressed as inevitability. After she left, Adrian and I looked at each other and made the decision quietly, practically, with none of the melodrama she would have enjoyed. We hired security for the wedding in Seabrook, just in case. And if you have ever had to prepare for your own happiness as if it might be attacked by the people who should have protected it, then you know the strange sadness of that decision. Still, I told myself maybe it would not be needed. Maybe life would let one beautiful day remain beautiful. I should have known better. The wedding day arrived in light so beautiful it almost felt merciful. Seabrook in June was soft and bright, the air full of salt and flowers. The glass house where we held the ceremony washed in white blooms and late afternoon sun. I stood in the bridal suite while Olivia fixed the last pin in my veil and stared at myself in the mirror with the surreal feeling that I was looking at both the woman I had become and the girl I used to be. The one who had sat alone by a restaurant window on Thanksgiving, wondering what was so wrong with her that love always seemed easier for everyone else. Eleanor came up behind me then, adjusted the fabric lightly at my shoulders, and said, "You are beautiful," in a voice already thick with emotion. Jonathan appeared moments later in a tie he had clearly fought with and lost, trying to make a joke because men like him sometimes use humor when they are too full of feeling to speak plainly. I laughed and hugged him anyway. Outside, guests were taking their seats. Inside, my pulse was loud but not frightened. Nervous, yes. Overwhelmed, yes. But beneath all of it there was a steadiness I had never known in the old version of myself. When Jonathan offered his arm and the music began, I stepped toward the aisle and felt something settle inside me. Peace, maybe. Or simply the absence of shame. Adrian was waiting beneath the arch at the far end, his face already undone by tears the second he saw me. We wrote our own vows. He promised to choose me in ways big and small, in silence and in celebration, in ordinary mornings and difficult years. I promised to never again confuse being tolerated with being loved, and to build with him a home where no one would have to earn the right to belong. People laughed. People cried. Noah sneezed at exactly the wrong moment, and somehow made it perfect. When Adrian kissed me, the room exploded in applause, and for a little while there was nothing in the world except joy. The reception took place in the stone hall just beyond the glass house. Long tables, candles, low arrangements of cream flowers, strings of light crossing the beams overhead. We danced, we greeted guests, we posed for photographs, and for the first hour I almost believed the security had been unnecessary. Then one of the guards approached quietly and asked if he could speak to me. I knew before he said it. There are 2 people at the entrance claiming to be your parents. Adrian's hand found the small of my back immediately. My stomach tightened, but not with fear. Not anymore. More with the cold recognition of a thing finally arriving after threatening to arrive for months. I could have had them turned away. The guard was ready to do exactly that. I even considered it for a moment. But then another thought rose in me, clear and calm. Let them see. Let them come into this room and witness what they gave away. Let them stand at the edges of a life I built without them and understand that their absence did not stop the story. Let them in, I said. But seat them in the back, not with the family. Adrian looked at me carefully, searching my face, then nodded. I'm with you, he said. A few minutes later, I saw them near the back of the hall, awkward and out of place in that beautiful room. My mother looked exactly the way she always did. Immaculate, tightly composed, carrying judgment like perfume. My father looked older, grayer, and strangely diminished. They stood near the entrance as if waiting for the room to remember who they were. But no one there knew them. No one rushed to greet them. No one offered them status. To everyone else, they were just 2 late buffets. Then the timing aligned in the cruelly elegant way life sometimes arranges its scenes. The MC stepped to the microphone and asked for everyone's attention because it was time to recognize some very special people. I felt Adrian's fingers lace through mine. Across the room, I saw my mother straighten subtly, anticipation lifting her chin. At weddings, this is often the moment when the bride's parents are acknowledged. Please join me, the MC said warmly, in honoring the parents of the bride, Jonathan and Eleanor Bennett. The applause rose immediately, bright and wholehearted. Guests turned toward the head table, smiling and cheering. Eleanor covered her mouth. Jonathan stood and blinked rapidly behind his glasses. Someone whistled. Cameras lifted. And at the back of the hall, my mother's face emptied of color. I watched the realization move through her in stages. Confusion first, then disbelief. Then something close to humiliation. My father looked from them to me and back again as if he had stepped into a version of the future he had never imagined, one in which silence had consequences after all. For years I had thought justice would feel loud if it ever came. But in that moment it was almost unbearably quiet. It was a room full of witnesses, hearing the truth spoken plainly. It was the wrong people no longer being called by the right title. If you are still here with me, then tell me honestly whether you think moments like that heal something or just expose what was broken all along. Because a few seconds later my mother started walking toward me, and I knew I was about to speak words I should have been allowed to speak years earlier. I thought the hardest part of my story was over once I had built a life that no longer bent around my family's damage. That is the lie healing sometimes tells us, when it wants us to rest. It lets us believe that once we leave the burning house, the fire no longer follows us. But some fires do not chase you in flames. They come back as letters, as phone calls, as old names appearing on a screen when the baby is asleep in your arms, and the house is finally quiet enough for memory to get loud again. My daughter Jasmine Eleanor was 8 months old the afternoon my father's name lit up my phone for the first time in almost 2 years. I was standing in the kitchen near the sink, rocking her gently on my hip while a pot of soup simmered on low heat, and rain tapped against the window in that soft, patient way Seattle rain often does. Adrian was still at work. Eleanor had dropped off fresh bread that morning. And for one foolish heartbeat, I thought maybe I could let the call ring out and keep the life I had made sealed and undisturbed. But something in me knew that if my father was calling after all this time, it was not because guilt had suddenly matured into courage. It was because something had shifted, something large enough to make silence impossible. I answered. His voice was rough and thinner than I remembered, as if age had moved through him all at once instead of gradually. He did not begin with apology this time. He began with the truth the way sick people sometimes do when their bodies no longer allow them the luxury of performance. He said my mother had collapsed 2 nights earlier at home in Ashford Heights and had been taken to Street Helens Medical Center. Heart failure, complications, exhaustion, years of untreated blood pressure, years of controlling everything, and sleeping badly, and pretending stress was something that only happened to weaker people. I stood there with my daughter warm against my chest and listened while he spoke in broken pieces. Clara was with him. The doctors did not know yet how serious the next week would be. My father said he was not calling to ask me to come. He said he knew he had no right to ask that. Then he stopped speaking for so long I thought the line had dropped. When he finally continued, his voice shook in a way I had never heard before. I found something, he said. Something your grandmother left. I think it was meant for you. I should have given it to you years ago. My whole body went still. Jasmine stirred against me and made a sleepy sound. I asked him what he meant. He told me there had been a cedar box in the back of his closet for years. One he had taken from my grandmother's house after she died. Because my mother said she did not want old junk lying around where Clara's children might get into it. He had not opened it until the night before, while looking for documents the hospital asked for. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name in my grandmother's handwriting. He said my mother had known about it. She had told him not to give it to me because it would only reopen things. In the silence that followed, I felt the old anger rise, but not hot and sharp the way it used to. This was older than rage now. This was grief learning there had been even more taken than it knew. My father asked whether he could bring the box to me. He said he did not trust leaving it in that house anymore. I told him yes before I had fully decided whether yes was wise. After I hung up, I stood for a long time in the kitchen holding my daughter while the soup boiled too far and the rain kept falling. Adrian found me there almost an hour later, the burner turned off, the room gone dim, Jasmine asleep against my shoulder. I told him everything. He listened the way he always did, without rushing to fill the silence. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Do you want to see him? I thought about that, really thought about it. Not as a daughter trained by guilt, not as the child who used to beg for scraps of tenderness, but as the woman I had become. I want the letter, I said first. Then after a moment, quieter. And I want to know who he is when my mother isn't standing beside him. My father came the next day. He looked older than the last time I had seen him at my wedding. Not just physically but spiritually, as if years of avoidance had finally collected their debt. He stood on my porch holding the cedar box in both hands like something sacred and dangerous. When I opened the door, his eyes went first to the baby in Eleanor's arms behind me. Jasmine had my dark hair and Adrian's eyes. My father stared at her with a grief so naked it made my chest tighten against my will. She's beautiful, he said. I nodded, but did not invite him in right away. Boundaries, I had learned, are often set in the first few seconds of a room. Adrian came to stand beside me, not confrontational, only present. Eventually, I led my father to the dining table. He placed the cedar box between us, and for a moment none of us touched it. Then he said what I think he had rehearsed all night. Your mother knew about the letter. So did I. After the first week. I let her convince me that giving it to you would only cause more damage. The truth is, I was afraid of what it might say. Afraid of what it might confirm. He did not ask for forgiveness. That, more than anything, told me he had changed. At least a little. I opened the box with hands that were steadier than I felt. Inside were a few things wrapped in tissue paper, my grandmother's silver brooch shaped like a laurel leaf, a ring I vaguely remembered from childhood, a bundle of old photographs, and the envelope. My name was on the front in blue ink, Evelyn, written in the careful slope of Jasmine Moore's hand. I did not open it immediately. There are truths you sense before you read them. I looked at my father first. Did you read it? He nodded once. Shame passed over his face like weather. Not at first, he said. But after the hospital. After what happened. I did. I should have been angrier about that than I was. But by then, privacy had already been one more thing my family had taught me not to expect. I broke the seal slowly. The letter inside was 4 pages long, written by hand, dated 6 weeks before my grandmother died. She began without sentimentality, because that was how she had always loved, plainly, with dignity and attention. She wrote that if I was reading the letter, then certain people in the family had probably failed me exactly as she feared they would. She wrote that she had watched the imbalance between Clara and me for years and had seen me become the child expected to apologize for needing fairness. She said she had set aside part of her estate for me not because she loved Clara less, but because she believed some children are given support while others are given lessons, and she was trying, in the little time she had left, to correct what my parents would not. I stopped reading then because my vision had blurred. Eleanor reached for Jasmine so I could use both hands. My father sat very still across from me, and I sensed that he was hearing the letter again inside his own memory. When I kept going, the hardest lines were near the end. My grandmother wrote that money was not the true inheritance she hoped to leave me. The true inheritance, she said, was permission. Permission to stop begging. Permission to leave any table where love is rationed. Permission to build a family from truth instead of obligation. Then there was one final paragraph that changed everything yet again. She wrote that there was a second document, sealed separately with her lawyer, to be released only if the trust intended for me was tampered with. She called it a statement of intent and witness. It contained details about private conversations she had had with my mother and father regarding the trust and the Willow Creek property. And if that document still existed, she wrote, it would make clear that what happened after her death had not been a misunderstanding or a clerical failure. It had been deliberate. I read that sentence twice. Then I looked up at my father. He had begun to cry quietly, the kind of crying older men do, when they no longer know how to stop their faces from telling the truth. She knew, I whispered. He nodded. I think she always knew more than any of us wanted to believe. We sat there in the dim afternoon, the box open between us, my daughter asleep now against Eleanor's shoulder, Adrian one chair away, but close enough that I could feel his steadiness like heat. My father said the lawyer who had originally handled the estate had died the year before, but the firm still existed in a smaller form, and he believed the sealed statement might still be in storage. He said he had already called and left a message. Then he told me something else. Something that came not from legal files but from the wreckage of the house he had spent his life protecting. Clara's marriage was failing. Her husband had known more about the transferred money than she admitted. Some of it had gone into his investments. Some of it was gone. My mother had spent years defending Clara, covering for her, blaming me for every crack in the family. And now as she lay in a hospital bed, unable to manage even her own breathing without help, Clara was still asking what could be done to protect what was left. The old version of me would have taken bitter satisfaction in that. Instead, I just felt tired. Greed does not make villains look glamorous in real life. It makes them look hollow. If you are listening and wondering whether truth always feels like closure when it arrives, the answer is no. Sometimes it feels like another door opening into a room you did not want to see. But still, it matters. Because truth does not always free you by making things better. Sometimes it frees you by ending your confusion. My father left before sunset. At the door he paused and looked back toward the dining room where the letter still lay unfolded on the table. Your grandmother was right about one thing, he said quietly. You should never have had to beg. After he left, I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time while Adrian washed the untouched soup pot and Eleanor hummed to Jasmine in the next room. My grandmother's words stayed inside me like a second heartbeat. Permission. To stop begging. To leave the wrong table. To build from truth. That night, after everyone had gone home, and the baby was finally asleep, I called the law firm in Ashford Heights myself and left a message asking whether any sealed directive or statement remained on file under Jasmine Moore's estate. I did not sleep much after that. Part of me feared what I might find. Another part feared the opposite, that nothing would remain and the last proof of intention would be gone. 3 days later, the firm called back. They said there was indeed a sealed supplemental statement, archived, never released, and if I was willing to appear in person with identification as named party, they would make it available. I stood in my laundry room holding the phone while the dryer hummed and felt a strange calm settle over me. It was the same calm I had felt on my wedding day, just before everything broke open. Not peace exactly, readiness. Some stories do not end when you survive them. Some only end when the dead finally get to speak. I drove back to Ashford Heights on a gray Thursday morning with the cedar box buckled into the passenger seat like something alive that I could not risk losing again. The highway stretched ahead in long, quiet lines, rain rising in soft mist from the asphalt, and for the first time in years I was not driving toward that town as a daughter trying to be let back in. I was driving there as a woman carrying proof, carrying permission, carrying the last piece of my grandmother's voice. Adrian had offered to come, and part of me wanted him beside me, wanted the steady warmth of his presence in a place that had once made me feel so small. But another part knew this was something I needed to walk into on my own 2 feet. Not alone, never alone again, but standing in my own name. When I reached the old law office, the sign out front had changed, the building quieter than I remembered, as if time had softened its edges, the way it softens everything eventually. Inside, a younger attorney named Mark Ellison greeted me with the careful respect of someone who already knew this was not just paperwork. He had the file ready. He asked for identification, confirmed my name, and then, without ceremony, placed a sealed folder on the table between us. "This has never been opened," he said. "Your grandmother's instructions were very specific." My hands did not shake this time when I reached for it. I had already been through the part where my life felt like it might split open. This felt different. This felt like stepping into clarity. I broke the seal. The document inside was typed, notarized, and accompanied by handwritten notes in the margins that I recognized instantly as my grandmother's. It began as a statement of intent, explaining that she had discussed her estate plan in detail with both my parents and had made it clear that a portion of her assets, including the income from Willow Creek, was to remain protected for me specifically. Then the tone shifted. It moved from explanation into something firmer, almost like a warning she knew might need to exist after she was gone. She wrote that she had witnessed conversations in which my mother expressed resentment toward me for complicating things, and a desire to keep the assets consolidated for Clara's future. She wrote that my father had remained silent during those conversations but had not disagreed. She wrote that she feared, in plain words, that her wishes might be altered once she was no longer alive to enforce them. There was a paragraph that made me stop breathing for a moment. She stated clearly that if any attempt was made to dissolve or redirect the trust, without proper notification to me, it should be considered a breach of intent, not an administrative error. She used the word deliberate. Seeing that word in black ink, backed by her signature, felt like the final piece sliding into place. This had never been confusion. It had never been a misunderstanding. It had been a choice. Mark explained quietly that this document, combined with the earlier records, could have supported a much larger legal challenge. Even now, though most of the financial elements had already been settled. But I was not there for more money. I was there for truth that could no longer be rewritten. When I left the office, the rain had stopped. The sky was still heavy, but there was a thin break of light near the horizon. I sat in my car for a long moment with the folder in my lap, and felt something unexpected rise inside me. Not anger, not even sadness in the way I had known it before. It was something closer to completion. There are moments in life when you realize the story that shaped you has finally stopped changing its meaning. I could have left town then. I could have driven straight back to the life I had built and let the past remain sealed in paper and memory. But there was one more place I needed to go. The hospital. My mother was in a private room on the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and quiet fear, the kind that lingers in places where people are forced to face their bodies without control. Clara was there when I walked in. She looked thinner. Her usual composure stretched tight, her eyes darting toward me with something like calculation before settling into something colder. For a second, we just stared at each other, years of imbalance hanging in the space between us. Then she spoke first. "You have some nerve coming here," she said. The old script. The familiar accusation. I almost smiled, not out of humor, but out of recognition. "I came because I wanted to see her," I said. "Not because I needed permission." My mother lay in the bed, smaller than I had ever seen her, machines tracing quiet lines of her heartbeat and breath. For a moment, looking at her like that, I felt the ghost of something softer. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the memory of the child who once wanted her to turn and say, "You matter." Her eyes opened slowly when she heard my voice. Surprise flickered there first, then something harder to name. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. I walked closer anyway. Clara shifted, ready to intervene, but my father, who had been sitting in the corner, raised a hand slightly. Not to stop me, to stop her. That small movement said more than any apology he had ever given. I stood beside the bed and placed the folder on the table near my mother's hand. "Grandma left something else," I said quietly. "A statement." She knew. My mother's gaze moved to the folder, but she did not reach for it. For the first time in my life, she did not immediately try to control the narrative. Silence stretched between us. Then she said something I had never expected to hear from her. "I did what I thought was best for the family." It was not an apology, it was a justification, but it was also the closest she had ever come to admitting that there had been a decision at all. I nodded slowly. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." Clara let out a sharp breath, ready to argue, to defend, to reshape. But I turned to her before she could begin. "You don't need to explain anything," I said. "I already understand." And I did. Not in the way that excuses harm, but in the way that sees it clearly. Fear, entitlement, the belief that love could be arranged like resources. My father looked at me then, something like hope flickering in his eyes, as if he thought this moment might end in reconciliation. "But healing is not the same as returning. I'm not here to fight," I said, more gently now. "And I'm not here to stay." I looked back at my mother. "I needed to see you once without all the noise. Without pretending." Her eyes filled with tears that did not fall. "And now?" she asked. I took a breath. "Now I'm choosing my life." There was nothing dramatic about the way I turned and walked out of that room. No raised voices. No final accusations. Just a quiet closing of something that had been open far too long. In the hallway, my father followed me for a few steps. "Evelyn," he said, and I stopped. Is this really goodbye?" I thought about that. About the years behind us. About the life ahead. "It's not goodbye," I said. "It's a boundary." He nodded, slowly, as if the word itself carried a weight he was only beginning to understand. When I left the hospital, the air felt different. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. Some endings do not remove the past. They simply stop it from deciding your future. If you have stayed with me this far, I want to ask you something honestly. Do you believe closure comes from others finally changing? Or from the moment you stop waiting for them to? Because that answer is where your freedom begins. I did not plan to see Clara again after that day at the hospital. In my mind, that chapter had closed with a quiet finality that did not need another confrontation to prove it was real. But life has a way of bringing the last conversation to your door when you least expect it, not to reopen the wound, but to show you how much it has already healed. It happened 3 weeks later, on a late afternoon when the sky over Silver Pines was turning that soft amber color that always makes everything feel briefly forgiven. I was in the backyard, sitting on a blanket with Jasmine while she tried very seriously to grab a handful of grass and put it into her mouth, the way babies test the world, with curiosity instead of fear. Adrian was inside, finishing a call. Eleanor had just left after dropping off a basket of fresh peaches, and the house was wrapped in that gentle kind of quiet that no longer felt empty. When I heard the car pull up, I knew before I turned around. Some instincts do not disappear, they just stop controlling you. Clara stepped out slowly, closing the door with more care than she ever used to show for anything. She looked different, not just tired, not just thinner, but stripped of something. The performance, maybe, or the certainty that had always surrounded her like armor. For a moment, we just stood there looking at each other across the small yard, two versions of the same history that had chosen different endings. "I didn't know if you'd answer if I called," she said finally. I almost told her she was right. That I wouldn't have. But instead, I said nothing, and waited. She took a few steps closer, her eyes moving briefly to the baby, then back to me. "He left," she said. It took me a second to understand who she meant. Her husband. "Most of the money is gone," she added. The words coming out flatter now, like facts instead of defenses. Not all of it, but enough. There was no apology in her voice. Not yet. Only the slow collapse of a story she had lived inside for too long. I nodded once. Not in agreement. Just in acknowledgement. She looked at me then in a way I had never seen before. Not as a rival, not as the difficult sister, but as someone trying to understand a language she had never needed to learn. "Did you ever hate me?" she asked. The question surprised me, not because of what it asked, but because of who it came from. I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "I resented you. I hurt because of you. But I don't think I ever hated you." She swallowed hard, as if that answer had not been the one she prepared herself to hear. "I thought you did," she said quietly. It made it easier. There it was. The truth that hides under so many versions of greed. It is easier to take from someone when you believe they are against you anyway. Easier to justify. Easier to sleep. I shifted Jasmine higher on my hip as she reached for my necklace. "Why are you here, Clara?" I asked. She hesitated. For a moment, I thought she might fall back into the old patterns, the excuses, the blame, the careful reshaping of reality. But something in her had already broken too far for that. "Because everything is gone," she said. "Not just the money. The way things used to be. The way Mom always fixed things for me. The way Dad stayed quiet. I don't even know who I am without that." I listened, and for the first time, I saw her not as the one who had taken from me, but as someone who had never been taught how to stand without taking. That did not excuse what she had done, but it explained it. An explanation, I had learned, is different from forgiveness. "That's something you're going to have to figure out," I said gently. The same way I had to. Her eyes flickered with something like desperation. "I don't know how," she admitted. The old version of me might have stepped forward then, might have tried to help, to fix, to make sense of her pain the way I had always been expected to. But that was not my role anymore. Not my responsibility. "Start by telling the truth," I said. "Not to me. To yourself." The words hung between us. She nodded slowly, as if committing them to memory. Then she looked at the baby again. "What's her name?" she asked. "Jasmine Eleanor," I said. Something in her expression softened at that. A small, almost imperceptible shift. "She's lucky," Clara said. "She has you." I held my daughter a little closer, feeling the weight of that sentence in a way Clara probably did not intend. "She has all of us," I corrected quietly. Clara nodded again, and this time there was something like understanding in it. Not complete. Not yet. But beginning. She turned to leave, then paused at the edge of the yard. "I don't know if we'll ever," she began, then stopped. "I know," I said. We did not need to finish the sentence. Some relationships do not return. They transform into something else. Something quieter. Something that exists without closeness, but also without war. She got into her car and drove away without looking back. And for the first time, I did not feel the urge to call her name. That night, after Jasmine was asleep and the house had settled into stillness, Adrian and I sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea between us. He reached for my hand and traced his thumb lightly across my fingers. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "Like the story finally belongs to me," I said. "Not to my parents. Not to Clara. Not to the past. Mine." The next Sunday, We gathered again around the table. The same table that had once made room for me when I thought I would never belong anywhere again. Jonathan was arguing about something trivial. Olivia was laughing. Noah and Mila were louder than necessary. Eleanor caught my eye from across the room and smiled in that quiet, knowing way of hers. Before we ate, she asked me to say something. I stood there with my family around me, my daughter in my arms, and I realized that what I wanted to say was not complicated. It was simple. It was true. There was a time, I began, when I thought being loved meant proving I was worth keeping. I know now that real love does not ask you to shrink. It makes space for you to grow. I looked around the table, at every face that had chosen me, and been chosen back. So here's what I've learned, I said. Family is not about who holds the title. It's about who holds you when life gets hard. It's about who stays when it would be easier to leave. And it's about choosing, again and again, to build something better than what you came from. Glasses lifted, voices echoed mine. And as I stood there, I understood something with a clarity that felt like peace. The story did not end when I walked away from the people who hurt me. It ended when I stopped letting their choices define my worth. If you've stayed with me to the very end, I want to thank you truly, from my heart. If this story touched you, tell me where you felt it most, because your honesty helps me tell the next story better. And if you're still sitting at a table where love feels conditional, I want you to remember this. You are not too much, you are not difficult, and you are not hard to love. You may just be in the wrong place. Walk away if you need to. Build something new. Choose people who choose you back. That is how he begins. That is how life changes. And sometimes, that is how you finally come home.